Welcome to Scotland's Hidden Histories. Today, we travel to the heart of West Lothian, to a village where the shadow of the kirk once loomed over every soul. Hit the subscribe button and like this video. It helps us keep these forgotten Scottish stories alive.
We're going to dive into a harrowing, true story from a small Scottish village called Mid Calder. It's a place where a perfect storm of religious fervor, local power struggles, and old grudges erupted into one of history's most brutal witch panics. Now, this isn't just folklore. This is the real story of how a community turned on itself, creating a killing machine fueled by fear and faith. To give you a sense of just how intense this was, let's look at the bigger picture. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, Scotland's execution rate for witchcraft was a staggering 5 times the European average, per capita. This wasn't just some background superstition, it was a full-blown national obsession, and it had deadly, real-world consequences. And who were the targets? Well, they were overwhelmingly women. Out of about 4,000 people formally accused in Scotland, a shocking 85% were female. So this was no random hunt. It was a deeply gendered persecution that preyed on the most vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, and really anyone who lived on the fringes of a very patriarchal society. So how on earth could this happen? To really get it, we need to zoom out and look at the national scene. This whole period is known as Scotland's Burning Times, and it wasn't just born from superstition. Oh no, it was built on a deliberate foundation of new laws and an intense religious zeal that was sweeping the entire nation. You see, the hunt in Mid Calder wasn't some isolated one-off event. It was part of a much bigger, much scarier pattern. It all really kicks off in 1563, when the Witchcraft Act made witchcraft a capital crime. That just set the stage for wave after wave of national panic. Mid Calder's ordeal in 1643 was a local flashpoint in this huge crisis, a grim preview of even bigger hunts to come. And get this law stayed on the books for over 170 years before it was finally repealed. Okay, so let's zoom back in on Mid Calder itself. We're talking about a small parish, maybe 1,000 people, but it was completely dominated by 2 powerful forces: the local church, the Kirk of Calder, and the wealthy, influential Sandilands family. This potent mix of religious authority and secular power created a crucible, and the Calder witches would become just as infamous in Scotland as their counterparts over in Salem. The spark that finally lit the fuse in Mid Calder arrived in 1643. His name was Hugh Kennedy. He was just 22 years old, fresh out of university, and an absolute religious firebrand. They actually called him Bitterbeard because he was short but had these incredibly fiery sermons. He wasted no time, quickly allying with the local laird and launching a full-on crusade to purge his parish of what he saw as the devil's influence. So, how did Kennedy start his hunt? He targeted a woman named Agnes Bishop. And the proof against her? An argument she'd had with a neighbor 25 years earlier. They had apparently called each other witches and thieves. Can you imagine? This old, forgotten village spat was dug up and weaponized by the new minister as irrefutable evidence of a pact with the devil. And Agnes was just the first. Over the next 2 years, at least 5 women from this small community were executed. Each conviction created a horrifying ripple effect. One woman, Helen Stewart, gave a confession that was then used to expand the hunt into neighboring parishes. Another, Jeanette Bruce, had her small estate confiscated to pay for her own trial and execution. But you'll see one name on there, Margaret Thompson, who was freed. And her story, well, it tells us everything about the brutal methods they used. See, here's the really twisted part of Scottish law at the time. A witch trial couldn't even go ahead without a confession. And that legal requirement, it meant the authorities in Mid Calder were willing to go to absolutely extreme lengths to get one. The methods they used for this discovery were, let's be clear, torture. Their main tool was a form of psychological torture called waking. The accused, almost always women, were kept awake for days, sometimes weeks on end. The cruel logic behind this was that sleep was when the devil could visit and comfort his followers. So by denying them sleep, they believed they were breaking that connection and forcing the truth out. And Margaret Thompson's case shows us just how horrific this was. She was kept awake for 26 consecutive days inside the local church. Just let that sink in for a moment. The sheer physical and psychological devastation of nearly a month without sleep is just unimaginable. And we know this because we have a direct quote from the appeal her husband, Alexander Gray, made to the government. He described her ordeal, saying she was kept waking naked, meaning underclothed or naked, and forced to stand upright for that entire time. It's an incredibly rare first-hand account that gives a voice to the suffering these victims went through. And that appeal, it's what ultimately saved her life. Make no mistake, this wasn't just mob justice. It was a grim, bureaucratic process. It started with an accusation from the church court. That was followed by interrogation and torture to get that all-important confession. Once they had it, the local authorities would petition the central government for a trial commission. The trial itself was usually just a formality, leading straight to conviction and then execution by strangulation and burning at a place they called Witches' Knoll. Okay, let's jump forward 75 years. The main hunt of 1645 is long over, but the fear of witches was still lingering. Then, in 1720, one last very strange case popped up in Mid Calder. It was like a fatal echo of the earlier panic, and it shows just how deep these beliefs really ran. If you put the two hunts side by side, you see a really crucial shift. In both cases, the accusations came from that same local alliance, the minister and the Sandilands family. But here's the big difference. In 1720, when they asked the central government for a trial, they were flat out refused. The legal establishment had grown skeptical. The local passion was still there, but the state was no longer willing to supply the legal machinery for an execution. But even without a formal trial, the outcome was still tragic. The accused women were dragged through the mud, forced to listen to a 30-page sermon condemning them to a lake of fire and brimstone. And even though they were officially allowed to go free, they'd been imprisoned during a brutal winter and had to endure this public humiliation. At least 2 of them died shortly after. The hunt was still lethal, even without the executioner's fire. So, how does a community like Mid Calder even begin to remember a history this traumatic? Well, today the story has become this complex mix of memory, local myth, and now, finally, some formal memorialization. If you were to visit Mid Calder today, you'd find statues and plaques for a figure named Lizzie Bryce. She's sort of become the face of the Calder Witch, the single story that many locals connect with this entire history. But here's the thing. The historical reality is that while Lizzie Bryce was a real person, she lived long after the witch trials had ended. Her story has become a local myth, and it's a perfect example of how a complex, painful history can get boiled down into a single, more manageable, but ultimately inaccurate story. More recently, though, something really powerful has happened. A memorial plaque has been installed in the church vestry, the very same room where women like Margaret Thompson were imprisoned and tortured. It actually names the real victims. And the stone for the memorial was sourced from the farm that once belonged to Janet Bruce, one of the women executed in 1644. It's this direct physical link between the memorial and the lives that were destroyed. The story of Mid Calder is just a staggering reminder of the pain and injustice of the witch hunts. But it also leaves us with a really profound question, one that's hard to answer. How do we, as a society, properly remember this kind of injustice and honor the victims when so many of their stories, their names, and their truths have been deliberately erased from history?